Nova Scotia's EMO asked to use the hall as a registration centre for residents of Portapique who had fled their homes. An RCMP officer was posted here in a cruiser. By this time, police were on the hunt for the shooter, who they knew was impersonating a police officer. At 10:30 a.m., 2 RCMP officers fired multiple shots outside the hall. Sources have told CTV News the officers thought they were firing at the suspect when it was in fact a fellow Mountie.
This program is brought to you in part by
Why don't you get yourself some turned-down collars, Poirot? They're much more the thing, you know.
The thing, Hastings? Do you think Poirot concerns himself with mere thingness?
No, I see that.
The turned-down collar is the first symptom of decay of the grey cells.
You know, I just think if people keep pushing, I can't, first of all, thank enough all of the hard work. There's 3 fellow YouTubers who are working very, very hard with me on this one. Rage in the Cage, Steve LTT, and Just My Stupid Opinion. Just plugging them, sorry. But they are fantastic guys, really been busting their humps here. And, you know, stepping up to the plate, because there's a certain amount of risk saying certain things. And also, likewise, all of the people who are volunteering information and time, which, like I said, over on the Discord or sending me anonymously information, it is fantastic.
Away we go.
That sounds great.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for watching. Thank you for joining. We're here with Paul Palango and a group of us, and we don't need to introduce who Paul is, because if by this point you don't know who Paul is, you really haven't been following the Nova Scotia story. Myself personally, I think he's one of the few reporters putting out actual reporting, and that's the reason why we wanted to have him here today. So thank you, Paul, for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Go ahead, Seamus.
Okay, so thanks very much for joining us. Do you want to just give us a kind of a rough summary where you're at this point in time?
Well, there's a lot going on. The one thing about this story, I mean, a couple things you have to understand about this story, and I think everybody does understand, is that there's a million tentacles in it, and there are not a lot of people chasing it. You know, because of the COVID lockdown and whatever, there are no journalists coming in from outside as normally might be the case. The Chronicle Herald has sort of reverted to its old sort of euphemistic name, the Chronically Horrid. So it's not doing anything. You know, in my time in journalism, this would have been the perfect opportunity to, you know, assign a reporter. I don't care how depleted your staff is, but this is a big story. Assign a reporter and just have them advance the story every day from any angle. And that's not happening. The only story they seem to be interested in is the domestic violence one. And that's, you know, it's tough to tell the story because this is much more than domestic violence. I mean, you're essentially watching the collapse of a national institution in real time. And nobody really understands this. They don't really appreciate it. I've run into a couple of people today who said, well, I'm not following that story. You know, he was crazy and I'm not following that story. And it gets down to the one thing that sums up this story is one question. If Wortman was just a crazy guy who did some crazy things, why are the RCMP and government going out of their way to cover everything up and release no information? That's the nut of the whole thing, you know, and you know, I think I pointed out to someone the other day that the most transparent thing about this whole affair is the lack of transparency by the government and the RCMP. They think they're hiding things and they're absolutely transparent in their efforts. So, you know, that's part of your question. I think that I'm pursuing certain things that a story that'll be coming out in the next few days in the Halifax Examiner that sort of going to move things in a, not move, but just sort of look at something we've all talked about in another way and just sort of bring it to light. I'm bringing something to light that no one's really seen before in advancing the story.
Right. So you mentioned the domestic violence component of this, which seems to be the mainstream media really wants to push that narrative. Do you have any feelings on why that is? They're so heavy into pushing that narrative. It almost seems to overlap the story.
Well, it's really disconcerting to me as a journalist, because it shows that it used to be that journalists were neutral observers, and they played a story. They like golf. They played it where it laid, and whatever the thing was, they went in a disinterested way and did what they had to do. They had no fear or favor for anyone. But now we have this sort of thumb on the scale about domestic violence, as if domestic violence is the only issue out there. Yes, domestic violence is a problem, but I have seen the police in the past create narratives around things like that. Because it's a place where they can hide, and they get all kinds of people whipped up. And it's to the point now that the Wordman's partner, Lisa Banfield, her name has never been mentioned in the legacy media. They do not mention her name because they don't want to harm her, because she's a domestic violence victim and it's creating problems. It's victimizing the victim. But that's not the case here. She may well be a victim of domestic violence, but I don't know that. Nobody knows that. We've been told that, there was an incident here and there was an incident there, and the police say, we're treating her as a victim. Well, this flies in the face of how the RCMP typically operates in this kind of a situation. I take you back to the Mayerthorpe case. In Mayerthorpe, James Roscoe, the shooter who killed 4 Mounties in 2005, I believe, he conned 2 guys, Hennessy and Cheeseman, to give him a ride, and one of them, he may have borrowed a gun from one of the guys. They had no idea what was going on. The RCMP spent all kinds of time afterwards putting these guys under the gun, eventually putting them in jail for 10 and 15 years. You want to look to another case, it's the Carla Homolka, Paul Bernardo case, where Carla Homolka complained of domestic violence. She had a black eye. She went to the police. She said, he beats me up. The police basically fell into line, said, Carla, poor Carla, we're going to deal with you, and we're going to protect you and save you, and we're not going to punish you for anything. And then, so they go after Paul Bernardo, they lock him up, and then lo and behold, they go and find out Carla Homolka was involved. So I'm not saying Lisa Banfield's involved, but I think the police and the media have to basically hear the whole story. This is, my big concern about domestic violence here is that it was invoked immediately, and everyone has fallen into line accepting this. But there's not a shred of real evidence that this happened. There are some suggestions that they had, or possible evidence that they had a fight that night before, and that he violently beat her up. But what was the fight about? Some say it was a fight about another woman. Well, in my experience and the experience of people I've talked to, that kind of fight doesn't lead to a rampage where 22 people are killed.
Exactly.
And if it does lead to a rampage, the first person killed is the person you're having the fight with.
Yes.
You don't save that for a treat at the end.
Yes. Lisa is an interesting character, and I really do think I'm in total agreement with you that this has been used. It's possible that she is a victim, but again, there is no proof of that. In reviewing Brenda Bo Forbes' statements, she is not a witness to anything personally, other than possibly one incident, possibly. The rest of it is hearsay, and yet she is apparently going to her commanding officer in the military and this is a very serious problem. This just doesn't seem to add up to me. What's your feelings on Brenda?
I haven't paid much attention to her. All I've looked at generally is that the flow of information about Banfield is very suspect. And when the last month or so, when the government announced, or the two governments announced they're going to have a review, well, what was a review going to be? It was not going to be an examination or of anyone. Nobody was going to be called to testify. Well, the net effect of a review was Banfield would not testify. This has been lost in the whole story, or that Peter Allen Griffin would not be testifying. Mm-hmm. Those are the two people closest to the shooter. Those are the two people who would know what's going on. Wortman's father would be someone one step removed, perhaps. None of these, the only way we're going to know what happened to Wortman, who is dead, is from the people close to him about what was going on. So why are the governments and the police going out of their way to have them not testify? This doesn't make sense. Because this is, again, as I said before, this is not the way these kinds of cases usually unfold.
Yes. And I find some of their behaviors, there is a pattern. I know you and I have spoken about the pattern before, and there is a pattern to things. However, the pattern seems to have deviated somewhat in this case because there seems to be a lot more public attention on it this time around, where you actually have the RCMP Campbell specifically reaching out to his friend out in Vancouver, Toronto Star, and doing the interview, the quote lengthy interview, which only subsequently was inserted in the article that was 5 days later after the families were told that it was going to air, and there was then a print article. But this is behavior I haven't seen before, where the RCMP are actually going out of their way to correct media and speculation. Would that be about right?
Well, in my experience, I've always had sort of this, well, not always, but as I got smarter and smarter about how the RCMP operates, they would work behind the scenes, and I've written about this, how they work behind the scenes to basically have reporters slag you, say bad things about you. And in this case, they're getting even more open about it, or Campbell calls things, I'll say, a fairy tale. But they're not supporting it with anything. This is part of their sort of character assassination of people who are basically their critics. They're doing the same thing that Donald Trump does. Attack your critics and impugn them with your own motives, what you're doing. Sort of casting aspersions by saying, projecting your own values and your own sins onto the person who's pursuing you. That's what they're doing, and that's very sort of concerning, because a police force should be there telling the truth. Governments, in this case, should be telling the truth. What is there to hide? That is the big issue. They're not telling the truth. We know they're not telling the truth. They haven't got the timeline right on a number of occasions.
Yes.
They haven't got evidence right. It's like they've concocted a story and they want everyone to believe it. Unfortunately, there's all kinds of people in Nova Scotia and Canada who believe them because they're the police. And they're sort of refusing to look at the evidence, which proves that they're not telling the truth. They say, oh, no, they're our first responders. They're our police. There are Mounties. They can't possibly be bad people or telling the truth. Or if they're not telling the truth, they must have a good reason for it. And so, yeah, okay, what's the reason? Tell me the reason. Why you're not, because there's no case they can be working on right now that is more important than 22 innocent people being murdered.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There is no case and if they say, well, we have this important biker case. Well, I'm sorry. A big biker case? I've come to see the bikers in the RCMP as being the old cartoon, Tweety and Sylvester or what do you call it? Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote.
Mm-hmm.
They need each other. And it's sort of this endless sort of battle where the RCMP brings down some element of the Hells Angels. They go to jail for 3 or 4 or 5 years. All the RCMP guys get promoted, and new RCMP guys come in, and the older Hells Angels guys come back, and they play the game over and over again. What it tells me is that the RCMP response to the Hells Angels is not very effective, and maybe something else should be done. And we should be looking at other things rather than sort of this endless cycle of making the RCMP sort of the overseers of the Hells Angels, or vice versa, some would suggest.
Yes, I know Steve had some points on that. Did you want to?
Yeah, well, since we're speaking of it, I mean, when you release the videos of the Brinks, I know at that point it was pretty evident that the thought was he's probably a police or a police informant, and maybe that's how he got this $475,000. Do you still feel that is the avenue? I
don't know. I don't know. Like, the whole point of finding the money was, I'll tell you how it came about. I was concerned, and I've been hearing from my sources that they weren't going to do anything. They weren't going to call an inquiry. They're going to call a review. And so I thought I was playing this game along the way with I could see what they were doing, and I had to find something to put more on the table so they couldn't call a review and say, oh, we didn't know about that. And so I went on Rick Howe and sort of solicited, sort of, as I said, investigative journalist performance art. I'd never done that before, but I figured, well, in this day and age, there's guys like you, and there's guys on the radio, and the daily newspapers are doing that fall. So why don't we try something different? And it worked. It was like, holy shit. Somebody told me what was going on, and it took a week to get it, and I got it. And interestingly enough, I've had sources who are familiar with this kind of stuff who say you're likely right, and there's some special relationship. And I've been told that at the beginning, and people continue to tell me that. And if you look at the statements by the RCMP, and when Darren Campbell was interviewed on the CBC by Elizabeth McMillan, he said 2 things. One, he's not an auxiliary cop. And he said, we looked for evidence, we could find no evidence of him being a confidential informant. That was his phrase. And I think you know what I've called that. I call that the Ted Bundy defense.
Yeah, wasn't it? We haven't uncovered. Was it?
Yeah, we haven't uncovered, or we have no evidence.
You can't uncover something you already know.
Well, not only that, but it's the Ted Bundy defense, because Ted Bundy said, when the investigators asked Ted Bundy, Ted, did you kill all those girls? And he said, there's no evidence that I did that. That's his quote. And a lot of criminals use that defense. Well, they're not saying yes and no. And people said, well, look, they said there's no, he's not a confidential informant. It doesn't have a special relationship. That's not what they said. And the RCMP speaks. I had a whole chapter in my last book about how the force speaks in half-truths.
Yes.
And in fact, that's what the chapter is called. They speak in half-truths, and I sort of showed how that worked over the years, how they've attacked reporters and things have been misconstrued. And, I'm a little off topic here, but it gets to the point where I start to wonder about some of the reporters.
Yeah.
You know, like, because in my experience, some of the reporters, you know, you just think you can't get it this wrong for that long and still have a job, you know?
Exactly. I was going to broach that subject. I know Steve and I were talking before, and I was like, oh, I'm not sure if I should get into that because...
You can ask me any question. I sort of, how I've survived over the years is before I write anything, I anticipate all the questions I'm going to get.
Mm-hmm.
And in the writing, you know, when I get confronted on a story, I'm rarely surprised by a question. There's not a question I can't handle. So,
well, there's a lot of people, you know, over on our kind of end that really follow your stuff. Like, I try and read your stories every time they come out, or if you're on the Rick Howe show, play them, and they really appreciate what you're doing. So back to the feminist lens, so to speak, the RCMP really are deflecting away from things that they themselves are having issues with, such as the Susie Bootland case, or abuse within the system of spousal abuse of RCMP officers, or abuse of other women. Now, nobody seems to acknowledge that. Linda McDonald, Zan, Sarson don't seem to acknowledge that. Jean Sarson, who of course is married to an ex-RCMP officer, which I find rather interesting.
well, I'm not sure what your question is there.
Sorry, that they're basically projecting, in using the media to project this feminine lens, when in fact they themselves are probably more guilty of it than anything. The Picton or the Galliford or these types of things, they seem to suffer from a real problem, even though inherently the organization is predominantly female, and yet nobody on the feminist side is saying, hold on a second here, what is going on within your own organization?
Yeah, I think quite right that they've lost sight and sort of lost their grounding on what are the real issues here and how these issues should be approached. You can't yell sort of, you know, like all these pressure groups are sort of one issue groups who aren't looking at the broader picture. And it's more important that we deal with, you know, we deal with those issues, but we have to deal with the larger issues, the sort of the efficacy of government and the efficacy of the police, because until we solve that problem, they will tell you everything you want to hear and do nothing. So if domestic violence is a problem, which it is, by complaining all the time about linking this mass murder to domestic violence, you're allowing the police to manipulate the situation. You're allowing government to manipulate the situation. You have to basically go after the police, go after the government, get real reform to make things happen.
Yes.
And don't let it, you know, don't get lost in this. And I mean, I find it really, really difficult to accept that, you know, when I've gone to media and I've talked to media, you know, so the legacy media in Toronto, and CBC and others, and I'll call them up and I'll talk to reporters. I talk to all kinds of reporters. Like I talk to you guys, and I'll say, why are you doing anything on Lisa Banfield? And they're going, well, we don't mention their names because we want real proof that something happened before we say anything, because we don't want these hordes of feminists coming after us. And I say, well, the real proof is right there. Her story doesn't make sense. People, you know, she's in hiding. She's the only person who knows Wortman and what was going on, maybe, but there might be others, but they're all hidden. And she was with him for 20 years. You know, 19 maybe. I might be wrong, that their anniversary is the 19th or 20th. She's an important character. the most important character in this story, from what I can tell, other than whoever, if Wortman was the CI, his handler. I mean, there are people who are important in the story, but she is key, one of the 2 or 3 or 4 people that we have to hear from. And it's her role, her duty as a citizen to come forward. You know, she can't just have a free ride here because there's allegations that, she was beaten up. As I said, maybe so. But the larger problem here is we have to solve what happened, why it happened, and get to the bottom of the story. And when everyone is hiding it and protecting her, it doesn't make sense. It's not serving the public interest.
Are you aware of any, because I've heard a couple of things about the condition in which she came out that have not been made known to the public via the media. Are you aware of those things which would
you show me yours and I'll show you mine.
Is there somebody else who wants to speak to that in here? Possibly.
And speak to that. You know, based on what I've heard, it was quite evident from her physical condition that she was absolutely not in the woods for 8 hours.
Okay, I've heard 2 sides of this story. In one version of the story, she shows up at a house on Portapic Beach Crescent at 6:30 in the morning, dressed in a spandex top, a yoga pants, and bare feet, with her makeup all done up, and looks fine. Hands aren't dirty, feet aren't dirty, and she borrows the shoes from the occupant of the house to go with the police. This person said she wasn't in the woods. There's no way she was in the woods for 8 hours. I don't think she was in the woods for 8 hours. Some people say she was hiding, maybe hiding in a shed. It was cold that night. I mean, Clinton Ellison had to go for minor hypothermia, and he was dressed, and he was out there for a couple of hours. The other story I hear is that, she was severely beaten up and was in bad condition and was treated in the hospital. And she had cracked ribs and this and that. Maybe so. I don't know. I can't the only way we can reconcile that story is by hearing what she has to say. It's quite evident that, not evident, but it seems to be that there was a fight, or she was attacked by Wortman that night. There are people who have told other reporters this, but nobody reports anything because they don't want to say anything about Lisa. But the problem, they'll say, well, that fight is evidence of her domestic abuse, being a domestic abuse victim. Well, Wortman is a psychopath. She's with the psychopath for 19, 20 years, whatever. That happens to people. They get sort of in there and they don't know how to get out. But the problem I have, and it's a reasonable problem, is that they had a fight that night or in the night before that. What was the fight about? We've heard stories that, it was a fight over another woman, as I talked about earlier. Or was it a fight about what Wortman was going to do? Those are 2 different kinds of fights. With 2 different probable endings. So we have to know from Banfield what the fight was about. And she has to prove that. Or somebody has to prove it, because there's got to be other witnesses there and other witnesses in the days leading up and the months leading up to what Wortman was really doing, because he's doing a lot of strange things. Taking money out, the tickets I've written about, the confrontations with police, and this fight. I'm prepared to give her a pass on it and say, okay, you were a victim. but I want to know what the fight was about, really. That's the issue. Because there are suggestions in the community that more nefarious, the nefarious things were going on that she may or may not have been aware of. And that's important in understanding what the fight is about and the nature of their relationship. Yes, it's an intrusion on her so-called privacy, but again, the public interest must hear this. And in defense of the 22 people who died, I think people like me and you guys and anyone else there who's trying to get to the bottom of this are acting like pathologists who are basically there to serve the interests of the dead people and their families. And we're trying to find out what happened. And we have to know what that fight was about. So I can't give her a pass and just say she's a domestic abuse victim because I don't think that's fair to the dead people.
No, there doesn't seem to be any evidence, and nor is anybody furnishing it, either herself or the RCMP, to support their case. I know that we've been speaking, because I can see the strategies that they're employing, or at least possibly foresee, and definitely if males speak to any of this, it's going to turn into an absolute bloodbath. So I know Kendall is strongly involved with, we have a second group set up of just women that are looking into the domestic stuff within the RCMP and within her case. And they solely can speak to that. Kendall, do you want to step in and talk about that at all?
There's a few women that are in that group that do not buy the Lisa Banfield story, basically because it doesn't make sense. A lot of it has to do with, for instance, her version of climbing through the hole in the police car with the guns on the seat. I don't know anyone that can crawl through those small little police car holes. And also, based on myself, if she'd have immediately sat down with those victims' families and told them exactly what would have happened, and she did not do that at all. And I think that Sarzan and Dan and McDonald are using these mass murder to benefit their own, when there really is not near enough evidence to needs to be looked at from a feminist lens, and it completely takes away from what answers the victims' families need.
Well, I agree with you. And I think the other point that is really clear to me is that it only, I haven't spent a lot of time looking at the sort of actual incident, because I spend most of my time looking at the police side of it. And when I started to think about the incident, recently, the impression I had was that Lisa Banfield ran to a house that was in the middle of the fray, in the middle of Portapique Beach Road, because it was never really described to me where she ran to the house. And I started to become curious about that. And, I called around and eventually tracked down that the house she ran to was at 140 Portapique Beach Crescent, which was exactly where I thought it might be, because it's almost the closest possible residence to the Brown Loop, from which Wortman escaped the so-called police cordon. But it also raises the possibility that Banfield was outside that perimeter. I can't believe she was hiding in the woods for 8 hours there. and ignoring all the activity that supposedly was around there. If she knew word was in a police car, well, there was other police cars. You know, she should be able to pick that out. It makes me think there's an extreme possibility that she wasn't even on the site and that she was brought back at 6:30. That is a possibility because that's exactly the time the police say they stood down. Has been previously reported that they, for some bizarre reason, in a mass murder situation where they still had not identified all the bodies and all the victims, they decided to go off shift and call in the next, as I understand it, the next incident commander wasn't coming until 10 o'clock. So at 6:30 in the morning, this key thing happens. They stand down. Lisa Banfield appears at the same time. Very curious.
That article too, the one article, I can't remember who that was that spoke out. Oh, the name is just eluding me right now. In the Globe and Mail, where it seemed out of place too for him to speak out and say, I feel badly, he drove the kids.
Dave Lilly.
Sorry?
Dave Lilly.
Lilly, that's right. Who spoke out and said, listen, we were going off shift and things like this. That's kind of breaking RCMP protocol usually because they don't publicly speak on their own. Do you have anything to add to that as to why that was?
Well, I think that's you're absolutely right that he said this. And this goes against the grain of everything the RCMP has not said, I mean, or said. Now, we're in a situation where, you know, it's late August, where, you know, what do we know? May, June, July, August. We're entering 5 months down the road. We still don't know what happened. We don't know any timeline of the shootings. We don't know what the RCMP did, who was there. It's all been extremely vague. And what Lilly said was one of the most important things in this case. We said we went home at 6:30 in the morning. And we know that they were standing down, as I've reported, because of all the things that happened in this interim. Lisa Banfield shows up at 6:30. If you look at the original CBC footage of the Great Village Fire Hall, they're all standing around doing nothing. One guy's helping firemen roll up hose. There's 4 SWAT team guys kibitzing around. Another guy's with a C8 walking around just bored, kicking up the dust. And then 2 sirens, or 2 earth trucks come through with sirens on, and they're out of there. Well, that's probably when they were responding to the next group of shootings. So we know the highways weren't locked down. We know nothing was being done. They were in neutral or beyond neutral. They were like comatose. It's unbelievable. And they're trying to say that, you know, the RCMP, as you'll recall, said, we did all this wonderful stuff. We were heroes. We went in there, you know, our teams, our tactical units went in there. We swept the houses all night, found out what was going on here, there, and everywhere. Not true. That didn't happen, and that will come up.
I know we do have a few questions that we want to run by you that were based on the RCMP, and because you have so much knowledge, we want to make sure we run those by you. But before Seamus gets to those, I do want to ask you one question. What's your thoughts on the fact that we haven't seen a CERT investigation and we haven't seen anything from CERT on this? And they promised that 3 months, I believe, is when they're supposed to have something.
Well, I have a really good contact who's a former executive level Mountie, and that person just focused entirely on CERT for the last couple of times I've talked to him. This is outrageous that, you know, he says there's 2 things there, 2 or 3 things with CERT. One, they're supposed to report in 30 days. They didn't do that. But going beyond that, because there's evidence that the police did not call a public alert, and because the police are obviously culpable for the 9 deaths on April 19, when they didn't block off any roads, didn't get in front of them. There are policing issues here. Well, a police officer was shot, another one was killed. There were exchanges of gunfire. They say Heidi Stevenson engaged Wortman. They suggest she fired her gun.
Mm-hmm.
That's a CERT investigation in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's not getting done. So you have to look at, they didn't, and then CERT, so basically CERT said, we're going to take the easiest thing, Onslow Belmont Fire Hall, which is strange beyond sort of tinfoil hat strange, and do nothing with it. So we're going to hide that. We'll do nothing there. But as my source says, CERT should be taking the big case, the whole case, because there's RCMP culpability, especially on the 19th, that's evident.
Mm-hmm.
And why are they not doing that? So the answer to that is the strategy here by the RCMP, the Crowns, and the government is quite clear. They don't want to create a paper trail anywhere.
Yes.
Because a paper trail will expose them and bring questions, and so they don't want to lay criminal charges against Griffin. You saw this big to-do the other day in the Chronicle Herald when they got his parole information, and lo and behold, look at all these things, and he's back in jail. But all he did was get revoked. There's no file.
There's no file.
They're not laying charges anywhere. And there's all kinds of charges that can be laid here, according to the police people I talked to.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't they not doing it? Because this is part of their strategy of burying everything and not inviting any sort of inspection of what they have done and not done.
Yes, exactly. They don't want to start anything. I know I get asked, and I'm sure other people here, Steve and Cage, definitely get asked about, are you afraid of the RCMP coming after you? And I say quite openly, I'm not, because listen, I come from a legal background, so please bring it on, because I'm going to start deposing. If you charge me, I'm going to start deposing a lot of people, and you don't want that. And they know that. They don't want any cases to go through because there's going to be defense lawyers, and defense lawyers are going to start asking questions, and you're going to have the paper trail.
Well, and then, this raises the other thing, and I've written about this in the past, and will continue to write about this in the future, about how one of my original sort of deep throat source on this said they're editing the evidence, they're burying things, they're doing all this stuff with their files. One other guy said they're pasteurizing the files. They're probably doctoring electronics. We have the phone that, we've heard so many stories about phones. Lisa Banfield's phone was smashed. Where did the pictures come from? Wortman didn't have a cell phone, but we have a black Samsung cell phone that we got in our searches.
Yep.
What's on those phones? Nothing is coming out. So maybe the RCMP are being sort of upstanding people and abiding by the letter of the law. And maybe they're doing the tricks and stuff that others say they're doing. Mm-hmm. But we can't know because they're not acting in a proper way that under the law that the police should act. Then you have to ask yourself the big question: what's the big secret? What's the problem? There's myriad numbers of problems I could see. You can almost pick and choose. It might be all those problems. It might be one or two of them, but there are all kinds of issues. Their own performance, the relationship with Wortman prior to everything. During this, why was Wortman given a pass? Why did they not get in front of him? Why did they leave him an opportunity to go all the way to the airport? Why? Why the ticket, the speeding ticket? Why all these things? What was going on? What's the big secret? And it always leads back to some kind of special relationship.
Yeah.
It's the only thing that makes sense. when you know, like one of the things I've said over the years in writing stories is that I have trouble writing a story, and I start off writing the story, and then suddenly I'm stalled, and I can't figure out which way to go. There are too many tentacles, and I can't really grasp it, and I can't really make the story flow. I'm looking at the story from the wrong angle. So what I do, I have to turn the story over and approach it from another angle, find another way into the story. And when you find the right angle to the story, it just opens right up. And things start to make sense everywhere. And right now, special relationship with police is the one thing that makes everything work, unless someone can show me another thing.
That's been my thing all along, actually.
Yep.
So I have a question, if it's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'll lead into it a little bit, Paul, just for anybody that watches this down the road, because I think this is going to be something that you're ready for. So we know that on the evening when this all first started, that several detachments were already involved, and they weren't in proper radio contact. And we know that all they have to do is send out commands, and they're all on the same radios, but for some reason that night they weren't. We know that, like you say, there wasn't any roadblocks except for at the end of Porta Peak Road, and that was a dog's breakfast. You know, and then the report comes in that, you know, 2 police officers at the scene wanted to go in, and they were told if they did, well, it's your last night, your last shift, okay? So leading up to that, and because the RCMP, unless Nova Scotia is something special to the rest of Canada for some reason, every detachment is under local jurisdiction of their area. So the mayor or the reeve of the council or whatever is the boss, okay? And we know that that goes all the way up to the provincial level. So at what point in the night or the next day or in this whole thing, with what you've been able to find out and your past experience and the people that you know and the conversations you had, I have a theory on what time it was, but when did the national service of the RCMP take over as opposed to what is supposed to be the local and provincial level, which should have been handling this?
Great question.
Well, I think that the answer to that is that first you have a grave misconception about how the RCMP works. One, local councils have no control over them. The province has virtually no control over them. They operate out of Ottawa. As I said, I think I used a line that but even Ottawa doesn't really control them. You know, as I said in one of the articles, the RCMP surfs along the borders of accountability between the province and the federal government. In this kind of situation, in their own playbook, their incident escalation, once they have multiple scenes, which they had right from the beginning, multiple scenes and deaths, that's escalated right up to the top, both federally and provincially. So that's the whole protocol. Multiple scenes, that's what you should be doing. But it appears here that a couple of things happened. One, I think this was an operation run out of New Brunswick if it was a UC operation, undercover operation.
Yep.
I think New Brunswick was in the loop too.
Yep.
That's what was going on. Also, it appears that based on what you said about the staff sergeant somebody giving the order about you go down that road and it'll be your last shift, it looks like at the bare minimum, Staff Sergeant Carroll was the guy in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And that no one up the ranks was in charge. So this is really curious. Like, this defies everything. So was this because of COVID lockdown? Nobody was working? Was this because they called in all kinds of Mounties and nobody wanted to go to work? What happened? Did they call, I can't even remember a FIDO. Did they call a FIDO?
Yeah.
F it and move on till it's all settled? What happened? Why did they bring, well, the more you look at it, you see they didn't escalate the way they're supposed to escalate according to their own manuals. Incident escalation goes right to the top. The guy at the top, Leather, Crops Officer, Chief of Operations, should have been in there. He should have been in control. He wasn't there. Why do they bring people from New Brunswick? But not local people, because according to their own thing, if a UC operation goes bad, you don't bring in other police forces if they're not already involved. That's another reason for thinking about UC operation here. But then you have the problem with communications. And I've been told that some point, if we get enough money together and enough interest, we should be looking at, journalists should be looking at, politicians should be looking at getting records of all the communications that were going on.
Yes.
But these include New Brunswick Fed Ops, Federal Ops channels 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the supervisor's channel on Federal Ops, because they were obviously the people involved. Same thing with Fed Ops in Nova Scotia, the ERT channels in Nova Scotia, but everyone else seemed to be on their own independent channels and not working cohesively. There's, when the officers thought he saw Wortman in Glenholm, there was no backup and no one to call. They're all on different channels. Was this by design, stupidity, or both? That there's no communication going on, but at the end of the day, we have to get into those channels and get the reports about what was going on, because they might not have spoken openly on all of them, and the supervisor would be protected, but not when the supervisor was calling into those channels. And so that's a project we're going to have to undertake, and people are going to have to undertake. I got some ideas on how to do it. I don't have the resources to do all this on my own.
Well, we're here to help if we can.
Yeah, and those are good avenues to go after, as well as the 911 calls, all the 911 logs, especially Halifax, which brings us to Halifax.
Yes.
What the hell was going on with Halifax police? The more I look at it, the more I start to see this as, were they involved in some sort of joint venture with the RCMP that involved Wortman? Because their behavior, on February 12th, the whole locked car in the lot on Dartmouth, where they go through this whole charade. Later on, when the Wortmans, they tell the ERT team not to respond. They set up a roadblock south of the airport and say, don't shoot Wortman, according to Tim Bousquet's story in the Halifax Examiner.
That was a great article.
So what the hell's going on here with Halifax? And they've been absolutely muted on this. They don't talk. They don't say anything, which makes me more and more suspicious every day about what their relationship was to this case.
Yes, Chief Kinsella, with the not wearing red, I thought was a rather interesting move. He didn't allow his officers to wear red. And the mention of Masstown I found rather interesting. I've never seen anything since that Tim Bousquet story of the mention of Masstown and the weapons in Masstown, because I can't find any reference to. Sorry.
No, I haven't heard anything.
Yeah, because it's in the Tim Bousquet story, and that source says, who has been verified. I think now, basically, he said, I've done as many checks as I can with this guy. And then subsequent information that has come out seems to verify, yes, absolutely, he was telling the truth. And that he is verifiable. But the mention of the Masstown, I thought, was rather interesting, and that they were ordered not to participate. Equally, the involvement of the Halifax Regional Police uniform that Wortman had, and badge, which doesn't seem to be, I don't know whose badge it is, but Wortman had a badge of some kind, and definitely had a Halifax Regional Police authentic uniform. Why does he have this? Where is he getting it? They said that he had a source, a friend, of course, not getting charged. Sorry?
I have no idea. I mean, I said there's a million questions here, and it's going to take a while to get to the bottom. Guys, I can't stay too much longer. I got something else going on, so
Okay.
maybe we can wrap it up, or I can leave. Or
Well, appreciate you coming, Paul.
No, if you got any other questions, I can ask. I can answer them as best I can. I'm hoping to move things forward in the next couple of days with an interesting story. I've got a couple of interesting stories on the go.
Can you give us a hint? If you don't want to.
So I've uncovered some things that were sort of overlooked in the past that may suggest where the real story is.
Wow. That sounds exciting. Green Bastard, Nova Scotia guy. Sorry, I didn't mean to dominate the conversation here. I apologize.
It's all good. I was taking a lot of that in.
It's okay. I do have one question before we go. Paul, you and I haven't talked about this, but I've been really interested in the 12:30 that night when they went to Nathan Staples' house, the tactical officers with the guns that talked about a hit list. And then, shortly after, the RCMP came out and said, there was no hit list. Wondering what was going on at 12:30. They seem to be doing an inventory of the cars, and Staples was related to, a possible target as not selling him a car. I almost got, from Lily's interview saying, we thought he was dead. We thought this. I'm wondering, I haven't been able to correlate that yet, but, if they're coming to Staples at 12:30 and saying, hey, did they think he was dead by 12:30?
I think they were hoping he was dead, but I think you've hit on a really interesting thing, that the whole notion of a hit list, where did that come from? Was this part, you can reasonably assume that this is part of a cover story that they're coming up with. They're sort of making the story up as they go along. They can't get the times right when they showed up, who showed up. The hit list story comes out, and they talk about this hit list, which, the Toronto Sun writes about, and maybe some others. But if there's a hit list, where did it come from? The house was burned down, the car was burned down, and Lisa Banfield was hiding in the woods. Where did you get a hit list? And then they denied there was a hit list because obviously the logic of the hit list story didn't make sense. And this is all part of the problem of what's going on here. It appears, and I'm not making stuff up. They like to say, oh, that Palango guy's making up fairy tales. I couldn't make this up. I mean, they come up, they say there's a hit list. Oh, no, there's not a hit list. They say this. Oh, no, that didn't happen. It's like they're coming up with a story. There's too many moving parts to the story, and they bobbled it. And they bobbled it a number of times. And now they're saying nothing because they know they've made so many mistakes that everything's going to be checked.
Thanks. I agree.
Anyway, on that note, I got to go. I got things to do.
Thank you, Paul, for joining us.
I hope this, but anytime.
Yeah, I hope we can have you back and do it again, because it was definitely helpful for all of us.
After the next couple of stories, we'll have much to talk about.
Oh, that'll be exciting. Okay. I'll be reading it early in the morning. Getting up early.
It sort of was held up because of the premier thing, and not the premier, the other stuff going on, the budget this week, and there's other stories going on, and we said we don't want to get lost in the shuffle. Okay.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you. Anytime, guys.
All right.
Take care, Paul.
Bye-bye.